This is Chuck Stahl looking at our second element of market power in the oil industry, and that is OPEC, or the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries. The Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries was founded in 1960 with 5 founding members: Iran, Iraq, Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, and Venezuela. There are currently 12 OPEC member countries, so the original 5 plus Qatar, Libya, United Arab Emirates, Algeria, Nigeria, Ecuador, Angola, and Indonesia. And there have been 2 other countries who have been in and out of OPEC, so the membership has changed slightly, but the goal has always been the same. Reading from the OPEC website, their goal has been to coordinate and unify their petroleum policies in order to promote stability and harmony in the oil market. Let me translate that for you. This is a classic cartel speak. The aim here is to increase price by reducing quantity. Let me start by looking a little bit at OPEC's history. In the 1960s, the oil majors operated Middle Eastern oil fields. So, for example, Aramco operated Saudi oil production, and that was a joint venture of Standard Oil of California, also known as Chevron, Texaco, Standard Oil of New Jersey, or Exxon, and Saucony Vacuum, later known as Mobil. The multinational oil firm set the price of oil, what was known as the posted price, and paid the countries based on that price. If we look at prices during this period, you can see the price of oil as set by the oil majors was very, very stable. It didn't respond to market changes at all. Now, there were some countries who encouraged independents to produce oil in their countries, and they allocated crude to the smaller firms, and that caused market prices to fall. In response, the majors decreased their posted price, which would have resulted in reduced revenues to the nations where the oil was located. And OPEC's first real success wasn't increasing price, but to resist a price cut that was being imposed by the oil supermajors. Now, throughout the 1960s, OPEC tried to restrict production in order to raise price, but they did that without success. In the next decade, events gave OPEC more power, and Libya was a key to success. So Libya was located in North Africa, directly across the Mediterranean from major oil markets in Europe. Politically, it was a radical government led by a young military man, Colonel Gaddafi, and it had a lot of oil produced by an independent refiner, Occidental, who relied on Libya as the main source of crude oil. Now, a couple of other things happened that gave Libya a powerful advantage. So the Suez Canal was blocked because of war from 1967 to 1975, and so that made it harder to transport oil from Saudi Arabia or Iran to the Mediterranean, and a trans-Arabian pipeline accident closed down another way to get oil to the Mediterranean in 1970. So at this point, Gaddafi demanded higher price for his oil, and Occidental, unlike one of the supermajors, had no options. It was an independent, and they agreed to pay a higher price. And that demonstrated to other OPEC governments their power, and we saw successively after that successful increases in the increased price of oil. This was particularly notable in 2 periods in the 1970s. In 1973, the Yom Kippur War gave the members of the OPEC countries a political motivation to act to boycott selling oil to Western supporters of Israel. And oil prices spiked dramatically from $2.93 to $11.65 in that year. So huge transfer, estimated to be about $100 billion, transferred from Western consumers to Middle Eastern and other oil producers. The second spike was in 1978 and 79 when Iran stopped oil exports during their revolution. And again, there was a huge increase in price, another tripling in price, the price going from $13 to $34 or even $40 on the spot markets. Now, British Petroleum had been in Persia since 1908, and in 1951, Iran had nationalized its oil. The Western governments had supported the overthrow of the Iranian government, and the Shah of Iran took power. In the late 70s, the Iranian Revolution against the Shah was successful, and that led to Iran cutting off oil production. So this spike in oil prices led to another wealth transfer, estimated over $7 trillion over several decades, and it also led to macroeconomic shocks in the United States and in Western Europe, where the countries were experiencing both recession and inflation simultaneously. Now, throughout this period, Middle Eastern nations began taking control of the oil companies. So, for example, Saudi Arabia, originally Aramco was owned by the oil majors in the cooperative agreement we talked about earlier. And in 1973, the Saudi government took 25% in 74. The Saudi stake went to 60%. And by 1980, the Saudi government owned 100% of Aramco. Other countries followed suit, and so we have a whole set of new powers beyond the multinational oil companies. We have these companies that are sometimes known as the new Seven Sisters. So Saudi Aramco, Gazprom, China National Petroleum Company, the National Iranian Oil Company, Petróleos de Venezuela, Petrobras in Brazil, and Petronas in Malaysia. Most of these are state-owned. And recently, some of these national oil firms have been vertically integrated from crude oil production into refining and, in some cases, into distribution. Let me turn to cartel behavior because OPEC gives a classic illustration of some of the problems of running a cartel. Now, the goal for any cartel is to act like a monopolist, right? To restrict output and to increase price. Ideally, they would look at marginal cost and marginal revenue to find the optimal quantity and then price on the demand curve. Now, in practice, OPEC's cartel was a little more complicated, partly because not all oil is the same. There are quality differences that lead to price differences for crude from different places. And the other part is that nation states do more than maximize profits. So there's political problems that could lead to difficulty for OPEC reaching an agreement. Some countries had large populations and needed high incomes. Some countries were at war and needed money for that. And so there was a disagreement over target prices and fights over allocation, who got to produce what. But OPEC, during the 70s and after, generally was able to reach some kind of agreement after extensive negotiation. The problem is that the cartel price, the high price coordinated by the cartel, right, gives each individual country an incentive to cheat on the agreement, to produce more than they are officially allotted to. So again, classic cartel problem like the one we looked at in agriculture, and I do expect you're able to draw these graphs. Right? So the price of oil is substantially above the marginal cost of production. Maybe it cost a country $20 to produce a barrel of oil. The cartel price is $80. There's $60 in profits to be had if they cheat. The problem is, of course, that if you increase quantity across the board, prices will fall. And this is exactly what happened in OPEC. Many countries increased their production beyond their OPEC allocation, as their production increased, as quantity increased, prices fell. Now, initially, Saudi Arabia cut their own production in order to maintain the high OPEC price. So in the early 80s, Saudi Arabia's allocation would be something like 10 million barrels per day, but their actual production was a fraction of that, perhaps 2 million barrels a day. And that was as Saudi Arabia was trying to offset the cheating by their other cartel members. But eventually, the Saudis reacted in a different way. Because the OPEC members were taking advantage of the Saudis' willingness to cut production, in 1985, Saudis punished the members by increasing its own production. Remember, they had a huge amount of their allocation that they weren't actually producing. And the price of oil crashed from $25 to $10, and the OPEC countries that had been cheating suddenly found big decreases in their revenues. And that led them back to the bargaining table, and there were, again, continuing negotiations, continuing agreements. People would cut their quantity, price would go up, and then prices would fall again. If we look at oil prices over this period, we can see the big increase in the late 70s as OPEC was first flexing its power and as the response to the Iranian Revolution. We can then see a slow deterioration of that price as the OPEC countries cheated, produced beyond their output. The big drop shown in the graph is when the Saudis punished and increased their production. And then you can see we have a variety of periods of agreement, and then where the prices go up, and then the prices go back down. That big spike in 1990 was the Iraq's invasion of Kuwait. There are certainly some analysts who think that that first Gulf War was an attempt to increase oil prices. As you see, moving forward, more and more price volatility, periods of decline, and periods of boom. Another piece that was important after the initial OPEC price enhancement was an increase in production by non-OPEC countries. OPEC, while they were big, major exporting countries, they never controlled the entire market, and other suppliers exist. So that leads to two problems for OPEC. One is, how do you find monopoly price when you aren't a monopoly? And then the long-run problem is, as other countries develop the oil sources, that OPEC loses more and more of its power. So there are some interesting models looking at how a dominant firm can maximize profits. One is known as the dominant firm price leadership model. And essentially what they do is subtract the output from the non-OPEC producers from the overall market, and then look at what's left over. This is the market that OPEC has complete control over. Then they can look at marginal cost, marginal revenue, and set the world price to maximize profits, even given this competitive fringe. The long-run issue was there was big expansion by non-OPEC producers, particularly in Latin America, some expansion of U.S. production, entry by North Sea oil, more offshore production in deeper water as technology increased, increased production in parts of Africa, big increases in export capacity from Russia and some of the former Soviet states, and increased production in the Pacific and Asian area. And of course, as the supply increased, that led to drops in prices. The other important issue is that demand in the long run is more elastic than it is in the short run. And Western consumers responded to high oil prices through movements towards more conservation, through energy efficiency, and through technological change. So oil consumption in the US dropped by 17% during the 70s and 80s, and imports dropped by 50%, while national income was growing by a third. So the decrease in demand, as people found substitutes for oil, led to falling prices. So if we look at the next chunk of time, we see that prices above a certain level can't be maintained. So if we look at oil prices over your lifetime, we can see that in the early 2000s, there were prices that were substantially lower than they had been a decade or so earlier, but they were slowly rising. Some of this was the decline in reserves, as many countries hit their peak oil, that their production wasn't able to be expanded further. And then, so that was the supply side leading to higher prices. And then there was also growing demand from emerging markets as income increased in poor countries and people had more motor vehicles and other demand for energy. The big drop we see in 2008 was really shown by the recession and the economic crisis that followed as we had lower demand for oil. This was then followed by economic recovery with increases in demand and the price going back up. And then what we see at the tail as prices drop again is the increase in production from shale oil, from tar sands, some substitution towards natural gas, and particularly the impact of fracking, which led to big increases in supply of U.S. oil, leading to prices dropping back down to where they were 20 years earlier. Now, since the beginning of this year, oil prices have plummeted. And this has to do with the situation we find ourselves in with the COVID-19 and the subsequent economic slowdown. Big decrease in demand, big drop in price. We are currently, meaning in the last few days, seeing negotiations of OPEC. They're having a virtual meeting, much as we are meeting virtually. And on Thursday, they were able to reach a deal amongst themselves. They're also negotiating with non-OPEC oil producers like Russia and Mexico to get them to agree to cut their production, looking for roughly a 10% decrease in total production worldwide. The U.S. has been supporting these production cuts, partly because of losses in the U.S. oil industry, and it is likely that there will be some kind of deal reached by the time you listen to this video. Let me end with a quote I like from a former Saudi oil minister. "The Stone Age did not end for lack of stone, and the oil age will end long before the world runs out of oil." This has been Chuck Stahl talking about OPEC and market power in the oil industry from Kalamazoo College. Thank you for listening.